Hey, Jonathan York, Bay Financial Partners, looking at the investment markets. The US-Iran conflict continues to rumble on. Now, still getting very conflicting reports coming out of the White House. Trump keeps talking about, a deal potentially could be done in the next sort of 2 to 3 days. But he's been saying that for the last couple of weeks. And while the sort of fragile ceasefire appears to be holding overnight, it looks like Iran has shot down a US helicopter, and Trump now says that the US has to respond. But then Trump also has come out and said that he's prepared to meet the Iran leadership and hopeful that a deal can be reached. So at present, just seems to be sort of a lot of talk and not much action coming out of the White House in terms of a sort of a deal towards Iran. Now, what's further complicating the situation is that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu has come out and said that there will be now a sort of a pause in military actions against Iran. Then the following day, Israel launches fresh strikes against Iran. Now, certainly Netanyahu is facing fresh pressure at home as he's in an election year, and certainly the opposition is all in favour of all-out war against Iran. So against that backdrop, really a pretty tricky time for Trump because, you've got rising gasoline prices, you've got the start of the sort of driving season in the US, you've got midterm elections coming up. And he's also suffered a couple of further defeats in the courts against some of his policies and actions. As Trump faces continuing backlash from both sides on the potential weaponization fund, which has now been sort of halted after testimony from the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. But in terms of the US economy, the latest jobs data was again pretty encouraging, came in at 172,000 created versus expected 80,000. And there was a small upward revision to the previous month as well. That was revised up to 179,000. Now, it will be interesting to see how this all plays out because obviously US is one of the hosts for the FIFA World Cup, and analysts are saying that potentially these jobs created are a result of the World Cup, and once that finishes in late July, these jobs will no longer be around. But certainly on the back of those stronger jobs numbers, it really was pretty interesting because the Fed's now facing a really pretty tricky task because you've got rising inflation. You've got a pretty strong economy on that job side, and potentially that doesn't mean that the US economy needs a rate cut. Which certainly makes the new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh's job, pretty tricky because, Trump would say he's on the tape saying that once Warsh is confirmed as the new Fed chair, he expects rates to come down. But if anything on these numbers, potentially you're looking at a possible rate hike by year end. If you look at US rates, 10-year is currently 452, 2-year is 408, and that 30-year is just hovering around 5% at 501. Now, interestingly, before the Iranian conflict started, the 10-year was around 394. Obviously, the other big news is going to be the SpaceX IPO, and it's really going to be very interesting to see where that comes in at on the price and how it sort of trades over the first sort of week or so, because potentially has some pretty major implications for those index funds, as it looks like it could be included a lot sooner than normally expected. Now, despite the ongoing nervousness and very fragile ceasefire with Iran, oil has actually come back below $90 now, currently trading at 88.20 and change. And that's on the back of the US Energy Secretary Chris Wright coming out and saying that ships are actually starting to flow through the Straits of Hormuz, without supplying any evidence or data to back that up. Now, that falling oil price is certainly good news for the UK economy because potentially it takes a little bit of heat out of the inflation numbers. And likewise for the EU region as well, and potentially it offers a little bit of hope as well for some of the airlines over the sort of summer period. And certainly EU inflation is obviously rising a little bit on the back of the Iranian situation. That's currently trading at around 3.2%, which is obviously substantially higher than the 2% target. But again, sort of sliding almost under the radar, you still got the Russia-Ukraine war. And again, despite his rhetoric, it seems that Putin has little interest in bringing that conflict to a conclusion. Now, latest GDP out of Australia was certainly a little bit weaker at only 0.3, which gives a year-on-year figure of 2.5. But that could be good news for the RBA because certainly with a slightly weaker economy and inflation not really rising as much as expected, potentially the RBA could be on hold now for the rest of the year after the recent 3 rate hikes. Now here in New Zealand, a bit of sort of a mixed bag on the data front. Latest dairy auction was a tad weaker, but still holding up at reasonably good prices. Latest building consent numbers were again a little bit encouraging as well because certainly towards year end it looks like there is some reasonable sort of projects in the pipeline. And obviously the New Zealand economy will benefit from the falling oil prices. And a pretty big week for the agricultural sector with field days taking place this week. Certainly the agricultural sector has been a standout performer in the New Zealand economy over the last 12 months. So it will be interesting to see what sort of orders are placed at field days in terms of the sort of farmers spending on the back of that big Fonterra payout just a couple of weeks ago. So if you are looking for income options, go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.